So I'm off trail in the forest today. We came out here crawling down this canyon looking for spring snails. So spring snails, maybe you've heard of them, maybe you haven't. What they are, they're a teeny little snail in the genus Pyrgulopsis. And so these animals live all across the western US. They have a very interesting evolutionary history. You see, a long time ago during the Ice Age, all of the West was covered in a lot of water, right? And as everything changed and got hotter and drier, all the water kind of shrank away. As you can imagine, we're in Arizona, so there's only little bits of water here and there. So while there was lots of water everywhere, these spring snails diversified, meaning they evolved lots of different species, which expanded all over the West. However, as the water shrank, they shrank down and only remained in little places. So the concept that spring snails are going to allow me to talk about today is what's called a refugia. And so what that means is originally used to mean when the Ice Age happened, they were the tiny little refuges where all of the living organisms like hid out while the ice was there, and then they came out later. But now it kind of means more broadly a refuge where a tiny piece of habitat is there that an animal or plant can go, and they're protected from disturbance, and they're protected from people, and they're protected from predators. So it's a spot where they're like safe, and sometimes it's very small, and sometimes it's very limited in scope. So in the case of spring snails, these guys, after everything dried up with all that water, they retreated back into these refugia, and so now there's so few of them that there's sometimes specific one species to one single spring on the landscape. So what this means for spring snails is when everything dried up and they sort of had to retreat back to those little places, those little refuges, the safe havens, that means that all of those species that diversified now were restricted to only one place. So in many cases, there's only one species per single spring. And so as of 2014, a paper I read said that 80% of all these species are endangered. Headed down the canyon looking for spring snails. We got cliffed out, by which I mean, so we weren't able to find any snails at the last site because we weren't able to find the spring. We got cliffed out. So we're at another site now. I'm gonna try to head up this drainage and see if we can find a spring that has snails. Now why this matters is because these snails are indicators of perennial springs, which means the springs that have water all year round. And they're just really interesting because they're so localized, because they retreated to these refugia. They're so localized that every spring can have a single species. And so it's really interesting to think about the diversification of life in these springs environments. So if we find spring snails in the spring, which goes further up the hill there, then what that means is A, they've been here since the Ice Age, which is pretty cool. But B, scientists use them as an indicator of water quality because they require very specific water conditions. They like certain temperatures and pHs and stuff like that. And so not every spring has spring snails. So we'll be lucky to find them, and it'll tell us a lot about the health of the spring. Success! This is how small a spring snail is. So I hear you asking me now, like, why should I care about a snail? And the answer is really, it's not about the snail. So the snail is kind of a poster child for springs, really. And so springs can be biodiversity hotspots, which means they can support a huge number of plants and animals, different kinds of species. And so it's important that we protect them. And a lot of scientists think it's important that we maintain them because not only do they act as refugia now, but they could definitely act as refugia in the future as well. So it's about the snails, but it isn't about the snails. You see, there's all kinds of things that can happen to springs. So development, people coming in, groundwater pumping can affect it, livestock being able to get in there, all kinds of things can affect whether or not the spring can be there perennially and support all these living plants and animals. And so uh, the thing is that we know not only are springs hydrologic refugia, which is such a fancy way of saying there are places, they're watery places that protect life in very special spots. But we know that they are now and they have been in the past, but they may become very important in this way in the future because the climate, we expect it to get hotter and drier in the Southwest, which means that it's going to be more and more important to protect those places where there is water so that all those really special plants and animals that nobody ever thinks about can have a place to go and stay and maybe be sheltered from all of those disturbances and all the climate changes that's going on outside.